The former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been sentenced to 5 years in prison after being found guilty of criminal conspiracy by a Paris court. The case was related to millions of euros of illicit funds from the late Libyan leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi.
Imagine being jailed for taking money from the same man whose death you helped orchestrate. If that's not karma, what is? This is exactly what's happening to former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. A few weeks ago, a Paris criminal court sentenced him to 5 years in prison for criminal conspiracy, all linked to millions of euros in illegal campaign funds that reportedly came from none other than the late Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi. What makes this story even more fascinating is that Sarkozy wasn't convicted by a foreign court or by any international tribunal. It was his own country, France, that found him guilty. The same France that once led the NATO campaign, which ended in Gaddafi's brutal death in 2011. Think about that irony. The man who once helped bring down Gaddafi's Libya is now being brought down himself by the very money he took from Gaddafi. In today's documentary, we'll uncover the full story, how a secret alliance between Paris and Tripoli turned into betrayal, war, and corruption. How millions of Libyan dollars flowed into Sarkozy's 2007 presidential campaign, and how those same millions would one day send him to prison. This isn't just a political scandal. It's a story about power, greed, and the haunting shadow of karma. For decades, we've analyzed one chilling pattern: how Western leaders have repeatedly orchestrated the overthrow or assassination of African presidents who dared to defy them. Every time an African leader stood tall, demanded sovereignty, or refused to bow to foreign pressure, their fate was almost always the same: a coup, a bullet, or a plane crash. These weren't just accidents of history. They were calculated operations, often carried out under the banners of freedom, democracy, or humanitarian intervention. But behind those words were the same motives: control, resources, and power. And what happened after these crimes? Nothing. The men who planned them, the politicians who signed off on them, the intelligence officers who executed them, they all went on with their lives, untouched and unpunished. Meanwhile, Africa was left to rebuild, to mourn, and to remember. But now, something has changed. It's as if the universe itself has decided to intervene, to balance the scales. Because for the first time, one of those very men, former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, is finally facing justice. The same man accused of taking millions from Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader whose death he helped engineer, now finds himself sentenced to 5 years in prison for corruption and criminal conspiracy. It's poetic, isn't it? The empire builder brought down by his own empire. The man who once toppled an African leader is now toppled by karma. As we mentioned earlier, Nicolas Sarkozy has been found guilty of criminal conspiracy, accused of taking millions of euros in illegal payments from none other than Muammar Gaddafi, the late Libyan ruler, between 2005 and 2007. But to truly understand how this happened, we need to go back to where it all began. Sarkozy wasn't just any French politician. He was a right-wing powerhouse, a man who rose through the ranks of France's political elite with sharp ambition and even sharper connections. He served as president of France from 2007 to 2012, but his political career began long before that. Between 2004 and 2007, he was Minister of the Interior under President Jacques Chirac, the very man he would later succeed. And here's where things get interesting. Because Sarkozy didn't just inherit power from Chirac, he inherited an ideology. Chirac was one of the most vocal defenders of Françafrique, a decades-old system designed to keep Africa tied to France, politically, economically, and militarily. In 2008, Chirac famously said, "Without Africa, France would become a third-world country." That one sentence summed up France's entire relationship with the continent. But Chirac himself was only continuing what his mentor, Charles de Gaulle, started. De Gaulle built the foundations of Françafrique after World War II, a web of influence that allowed France to control African nations indirectly, even after granting them independence. It was colonialism reinvented, softer, quieter, but just as powerful. When Nicolas Sarkozy came into power, he didn't break away from this system. He perfected it. He used everything he learned from Chirac: the diplomacy, the secret deals, and the money that flowed from African leaders who wanted to stay in France's good graces. And one of those leaders was Muammar Gaddafi. Like many before him, Gaddafi believed that helping Sarkozy win power would protect his own interests and strengthen ties with France. What he didn't know was that he was funding the rise of the very man who would later destroy him. You see, what most people don't realize is that for decades, African leaders were the ones funding French elections. Yes, the same Africa that's often labeled as poor and dependent on aid was, in reality, bankrolling the very politicians who ruled France. And this isn't speculation or rumor, it's a documented truth. This shocking revelation came from Robert Bourgi, a man born in Senegal who became a trusted advisor to both Jacques Chirac and Nicolas Sarkozy. Bourgi wasn't just an observer, he was deep inside the system. A man who moved between African presidential palaces and the Élysée with ease, managing the flow of political favors and secret cash. Earlier this year, Bourgi published a book that pulled the curtain back on one of France's deepest political secrets: how Africa funded France's democracy. According to him, it wasn't an occasional transaction. It was a full-blown system. Long before he entered the scene in the 1980s, the practice was already well established. African presidents, especially those from Francophone countries, regularly sent bags of cash to Paris to fund French political campaigns. Bourgi revealed that Jacques Chirac, France's president from 1995 to 2007, was one of the biggest beneficiaries of this hidden network. He allegedly received around $10 million for each of the presidential elections he won in 1995 and 2002. The money didn't come from French donors or corporations. It came straight from Africa. And the most generous contributor of all was Omar Bongo, the late president of Gabon, who for decades served as France's most loyal ally in Africa. So while French leaders stood on podiums preaching democracy and governance, they were quietly being financed by the very African leaders they often lectured and controlled. It's a dark irony, one that exposes how Françafrique wasn't just about influence, it was about money, loyalty, and control. And Nicolas Sarkozy, the so-called reformer, learned from the best. He inherited this secret system. And when it was his turn to run for office, Muammar Gaddafi became his golden ticket. But what began as funding would end in betrayal, war, and karma. Bourgi's revelations didn't stop there. What he described next sounded like something straight out of a political thriller. According to him, every time an election approached in France, President Jacques Chirac would quietly send him on a mission across Africa. His task was simple, yet deeply corrupt. He would deliver a coded message to several African presidents, reminding them that France had an election coming up and that it was time to show support. The African leaders understood perfectly what that meant. Within days, their envoys would arrive in Paris carrying millions of dollars or CFA francs in cash. Bourgi would then personally deliver the money through the underground corridors of the Élysée Palace, right into the hands of Chirac himself. The money didn't come in bank transfers or official donations. It came hidden in briefcases, sports bags, and sometimes even African drums. Bourgi recalled one incident during the 2002 French election when a representative from Burkina Faso's president, Blaise Compaoré, arrived in Paris with a huge sum concealed inside traditional djembe drums. Bourgi said he accompanied the envoy to the Élysée Palace, where Chirac personally greeted them. Inside a quiet room, they cut open the sealed drums with scissors and outspilled stacks of banknotes. It was money meant to secure France's presidency, from the pockets of African nations struggling with poverty and instability. Both sides, the French and the African elites, ensured the system ran smoothly and stayed secret. It was a cycle of power, corruption, and mutual protection. The African leaders bought influence in Paris, and in return, France protected their regimes, no matter how oppressive they were at home. But the question remains, why did Robert Bourgi decide to expose it all? It turns out he didn't do it out of guilt or courage. According to Bourgi, he revealed the truth because of a promise. Before his death, Omar Bongo, the long-serving president of Gabon and one of Chirac's biggest financiers, had asked Bourgi to tell the world the truth after he was gone. And Bongo wanted the world to know how deeply France was entangled in Africa's political corruption. So in 2011, 2 years after Bongo's death, Bourgi decided to honor that promise. When he finally spoke, the illusion shattered. The world learned that for decades, France's democracy had been built on Africa's stolen wealth, carried not in suitcases of diplomacy, but in drums of betrayal. When Bourgi's revelations first came out, both African and French officials rushed to deny everything. Governments from the implicated African countries called the story baseless, while officials in Paris dismissed it as political fiction. But interestingly, one former presidential advisor in Ivory Coast quietly admitted that such deals were a historical practice. An investigation was launched, not because they wanted justice, but because public pressure made it unavoidable. Yet, as always, the case was quietly dropped, with authorities claiming the payments were made too long ago. Imagine that. Corruption so old it becomes acceptable. But that's not where our story ends. Because today our focus is on Nicolas Sarkozy, the man who learned from that very system and took it to another level. Sarkozy already knew how the game worked. He'd watched Jacques Chirac receive millions from African presidents and understood that foreign money was the hidden fuel behind French politics. So, when Chirac's presidency ended and Sarkozy set his eyes on the 2007 elections, he simply followed the same playbook, but with a new twist. Instead of turning to the usual African donors, Sarkozy decided to go straight to Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi. At the time, Gaddafi was a political outcast in the West, branded as a dictator, accused of sponsoring terrorism, and suffocating under sanctions and isolation. But for Sarkozy, that was an opportunity. He promised Gaddafi something irresistible: rehabilitation. He would help rebuild Gaddafi's reputation in Europe and open the doors of Western diplomacy again in exchange for money. And Gaddafi, hoping to repair his image and secure a powerful ally in Europe, agreed. He secretly funded Sarkozy's presidential campaign with millions of euros, funneled through a network of Libyan intermediaries and French operatives. It worked. In 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy won the election and became president of France. And as a symbolic gesture of gratitude, he invited Muammar Gaddafi to the Élysée Palace in Paris, rolling out the red carpet for the man the West had once called the mad dog of the Middle East. For Gaddafi, it was proof that his investment had paid off. But what he didn't know was that the same man smiling beside him in Paris would one day lead the charge to destroy him. But after Sarkozy won the presidency, everything changed. The promises, the friendship, the handshakes, all of it vanished. Sarkozy conveniently forgot the deal he made with Gaddafi. The man who once smiled beside the Libyan leader in Paris soon became one of his loudest critics. When the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, Libya was swept into chaos as protests spread across the country. And who was among the first Western leaders to call for intervention? Nicolas Sarkozy. The same man who had taken Gaddafi's money now painted him as a global threat. That same year, Sarkozy publicly described Libya's leader as a danger to international financial stability, echoing the same talking points pushed by Washington and London. Behind closed doors, Sarkozy began coordinating with US President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Together, they built the coalition that would lead to Gaddafi's downfall and assassination. Under the banner of protecting democracy, NATO bombed Libya, destroying the nation's infrastructure and plunging it into years of civil war. But the truth behind the Libyan revolution is far darker. Those so-called pro-democracy rebels were not spontaneous citizens rising up for freedom. They were trained and supported by Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA. And through it all, Sarkozy stood firmly with them, pushing for airstrikes and celebrating Gaddafi's defeat. The irony is almost unbearable. The same man who once accepted millions from Gaddafi to win power in France now helped orchestrate his death. In fact, back in 2011, a Libyan news agency revealed that Gaddafi's government had indeed financed Sarkozy's 2007 campaign, the first time the world heard whispers of the secret deal. But, as always, Sarkozy denied everything, and the Western media turned away. The story disappeared just as quickly as it surfaced. Yet the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. And years later, that same revelation, ignored and dismissed by the West, would come back to haunt Nicolas Sarkozy, marking the beginning of his political and moral downfall. In 2014, the truth started to break through the cracks. During a recorded interview with France 3 TV, The late Muammar Gaddafi was quoted by France 24 as saying, "Sarkozy is mentally deficient. It's thanks to me that he became president. We gave him the funds that allowed him to win." They were the words of a man shocked by betrayal. It's not hard to understand why Gaddafi said it. He couldn't believe that the man whose political rise he helped finance was now leading the charge to destroy him. That same year, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the Libyan leader's son, confirmed it publicly in an interview with Euronews. "We funded Sarkozy's campaign. The first thing we ask of this clown is that he return the money to the Libyan people, but he let us down." But even before that, evidence had already begun to surface. In 2012, the French investigative outlet Mediapart published a leaked document reportedly from the Libyan secret services, dated December 2006. It mentioned a formal agreement between Gaddafi's regime and Sarkozy's camp. 50 million euros earmarked for Sarkozy's 2007 presidential campaign. At the time, Sarkozy brushed it off, calling the document a forgery and a political smear. Then, in 2016, another bombshell dropped. Ziad Taqiyuddin, a French-Lebanese businessman and longtime political fixer, claimed he personally delivered 5 million euros in cash from Libya to Sarkozy and his chief of staff. He described carrying the money in suitcases, handed over in private meetings in Paris. Years later, in 2020, Taqiyuddin retracted his testimony after fleeing to Lebanon. A move many believe came under pressure from Sarkozy's allies. So yes, this case has haunted Sarkozy for more than a decade. For years, he denied, deflected, and hid behind his political influence. But justice has a long memory. Finally, in January this year, French prosecutors said they had enough evidence to bring Sarkozy to trial. Their argument was simple but devastating. When Sarkozy was Minister of the Interior, he made a corrupt deal with Gaddafi, promising political legitimacy and international support for Libya in exchange for millions of euros to fund his presidential campaign. The evidence was no longer whispers, rumors, or conspiracy. It was documented, cross-verified, and undeniable. The same system that once protected him finally turned on him. And this time, Nicolas Sarkozy could no longer run from the truth. The agreement was alleged to have been carried out via a network of Libyan spies, a convicted terrorist, arms dealers, and millions of euros shipped to Paris in suitcases. Overall, the charges he faced in his trial, which came after a 10-year anti-corruption probe, were concealing the embezzlement of public funds, passive corruption, illegal campaign financing, and criminal conspiracy with a view to committing a crime. Besides Sarkozy, there were 11 other defendants, including the late French-Lebanese businessman Ziad Taqiyuddin, Claude Guéant, a former close aide of Sarkozy, Eric Walkerth, Sarkozy's former head of campaign financing, and Brice Hortefeux, a former minister. After the 8-month-long trial, the Paris criminal court finally gave the verdict. While the court acquitted Sarkozy of the other charges, including passive corruption and illegal campaign financing, he was found guilty of criminal conspiracy between 2005 and 2007. This is because he has presidential immunity against prosecution for actions after he became president in 2007. The judge stated there was no evidence that Sarkozy struck a deal with Gaddafi or that funds sent from Libya ended up in Sarkozy's campaign, even though the timing aligned and the money's routes were very opaque. However, she found Sarkozy guilty of criminal conspiracy for allowing close aides to contact Libyan individuals in an attempt to secure campaign financing. He was also ordered to pay a fine of 100,000 euros. Not surprisingly, Sarkozy claimed that he is innocent and will appeal the 5-year prison sentence, which could take immediate effect. The judge has stated that Sarkozy will have only a brief period to settle his affairs before prosecutors require him to report to prison, which will likely be within a month. If they absolutely want me to sleep in jail, I will sleep in jail, but with my head held high, Sarkozy said to reporters after the ruling was announced. However, this verdict makes it the first time a French president has received such a sentence. Following his conviction, he has been stripped of his Legion of Honor, the country's highest distinction. So, even if he appeals the sentence, the fact remains that his reputation has been damaged forever. He will forever go down in the annals of French history as the first former president to receive such a sentence. In our opinion, this is well-deserving. He deserves all this and more for all the atrocities that he committed as the president against Libya and Francophone Africa. Thanks to this man, Libya, which was once the most developed country in Africa on par with Western countries, has become a failed state. Western analysts love dismissing the achievements of other countries and labeling their leaders dictators. But the truth is, Libya was much better off under Gaddafi. It had oil, gold, water, and resource independence. History is littered with African, Arab, and Latin leaders killed by the United States for daring to make their countries better and seeking to challenge Western hegemony. Gaddafi is no exception. There is nothing the West hates more than an Arab leader who opposed imperialism, Zionism, and wants his country and other Arab and African countries to be self-sufficient. That is why NATO and Sarkozy murdered Gaddafi. While most of them have gone unpunished for their crimes, the former French president has finally met his punishment. And the ironic thing is that he was prosecuted by his own people. Like we said, it's a well-deserving punishment. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.